Have you ever wondered what happened to a gladiator's body after he died in the arena? Because one thing is for sure. The Romans knew how to put on a show, but no one tells you what came next. The crowd screamed, blood stained the sand, and when the body fell, the show went on. But as soon as the fight was over, that body had to disappear quickly. And no, it was not taken away with honor or ceremony. No dignified burial or tributes. The destination was a dark and practical place, hidden behind the bleachers, the so-called spoliarium. There, the dead were dragged away without mercy. There was no sadness, only efficiency. What mattered was not the man, but what he carried. Armor, swords, shields, everything was removed and reused. After all, for the Romans, a dead gladiator was just another worn-out piece of the great game. And that was just the beginning. What happened in that place said a lot about the way Rome viewed life, death, and the value of people. Hold on, before I continue, I need your help. YouTube will only share this video with more people if it has a lot of interaction. In other words, without your comment, this knowledge could be buried and never reach those who need it. If this content makes sense to you, comment 1. If you disagree, comment 0 and tell me why. I want to see at least 100 comments here so that YouTube understands that this subject needs to be spread. So comment now and be part of this mission to reveal the secrets of ancient Rome. Now that you know that the bodies of the gladiators ended up in a place called Spoliarium, it is worth understanding better what this place was, because it was not just any room. Imagine a kind of dark backstage far from the applause where the harsh reality of death appeared without makeup. It was there that the fallen gladiators were carried away as soon as they left the arena, dragged like damaged goods. And the name says a lot. Spoliarium comes from spoil, which in Latin means spoils, that is, what is taken from someone after death. In this case, what was taken were combat objects: helmet, armor, shield, sandals, any item that could still be useful to another fighter. It was an almost mechanical process. A man died, his things were reused, and the body, well, we'll talk about that in a moment. The important thing here is to understand how the Romans saw everything as part of a system. The show could not stop, and every piece of that system had to work with precision. Spoliarium was part of this. Mechanism, ugly, functional, necessary. There, death was treated as logistics. As soon as the body arrived at the spoliarium, there was no time to waste. The slaves and staff of the amphitheater already knew exactly what to do. Remove everything the dead gladiator was wearing. Nothing was left aside. Armor was expensive, swords were precious. Even sandals could be reused. Each item was removed with care, not out of respect for the dead, but because it cost money. And in ancient Rome, anything that could be reused was. These objects were returned to the amphitheater's arsenals or passed on to new gladiators. It was as if the deceased were donating his uniform to the next person to enter the arena. And if any item was damaged, it was repaired. Not for honor, but for practicality. Now look how interesting. Even when dead, these men continued to serve the system. Not even their cold bodies could escape the machinery. It was as if the show continued even after their last breath. After everything of value was stripped away, the body was left. And that's when things get even more complicated. Because, unlike what many people imagine, the dead gladiators were not honored or given honorable burials. Quite the opposite. Many of them were considered mere property, slaves, prisoners of war, convicts. Death in the arena did not erase that status. So, for Rome, that body had no symbolic importance. It was just another discarded item. What actually happened? Some bodies were dumped in mass graves. Others, if they had some abnormal value, for example, if they were popular figures or had wealthy sponsors, could even be claimed by someone and given a burial. But these cases were the exception, not the rule. Most disappeared anonymously. Some archaeological reports suggest that even the remains were used, such as in archaic medicine rituals or superstitions, but this still generates debate among scholars. The Truth is that in the Rome of bread and circuses, even death was silent. The public went home satisfied and the body disappeared without anyone caring. As the centuries passed, more dramatic stories began to emerge about the fate of these gladiators. Many people believe that after their deaths, they were part of some kind of symbolic ceremony, with processions, torches, hooded priests, as if death in the arena was an almost sacred ritual. But this has much more to do with modern imagination than historical reality. This image, which is reminiscent of scenes from films or games, is the result of later interpretations from a time when Rome had already been profoundly transformed by Christianity. In this more theatrical phase, reports emerged of performances that mixed figures from mythology, such as Charon, the ferryman of the dead, or Hades, the god of the underworld. But when we look at the most reliable sources from the gladiatorial era, this kind of parade simply does not appear. What existed was efficiency, not staging. The reality was harsh and direct. Of course, the popular imagination loves a good drama, and over time, many people began to romanticize what was, in fact, a cold trial. These stories became legends, and like all good legends, they mixed fantasy with a grain of truth. But Rome, when it came to the behind the scenes of the show, was a lot less romantic than we'd like to believe. So let's get straight to the point. Those stories about men dressed as Charon dragging the dead from the arena, or of reenactments with Hades judging the souls. Did that really happen? The short answer? Probably not. These mythological figures do appear in some sources, but almost always in accounts much later than the height of gladiatorial combat. In other words, these records are influenced by different eras, by religious and symbolic visions that emerged well after the most brutal times of the arena. The idea of someone dressed as Charon, with a scary mask and a mallet, certifying the death of a gladiator, is more a product of popular imagination and of writers who wanted to dramatize the events than of concrete historical facts. It's as if, centuries later, someone looked at the Roman games and said, "Oh, there must have been a rite of passage to the afterlife. Let's put a symbolic character in this story." It makes sense within the mythological narrative, but it doesn't fit with the practical reality of the Romans. They were far more interested in efficiency than in allegory. The arena was a business, and like any business, what mattered was the next show, not the soul of the one who died there. Many people wonder, but if Rome loved mythology so much, why didn't they mix it with combat? Didn't they create some kind of symbolic theater with death? The answer is, it depends. Yes, there were theatrical performances. Yes, there were performances, but not in the spiritual sense that many imagine. What the Romans did was use the arena as a stage to display power, punishment, and dominance. Sometimes they would reenact famous battles or myths, but with one twist: they used real people dying for real. For example, there were cases where prisoners were forced to play mythological characters in death spectacles. Someone might be forced to play Prometheus chained to a rock and be devoured by animals there, in front of everyone, or act out the myth of Orpheus, being literally torn apart by wild beasts at the end. So yes, the show had a touch of mythology, but it was much more cruelty disguised as art than any kind of symbolic homage to the gods. The arena was where fantasy turned to carnage, where stories came to life, but at the cost of someone's life. By now you've realized that much of what we imagine about gladiators comes from movies, books, and even our own desire to find meaning in so much brutality. But when we go directly to the historical sources, ancient texts, period accounts, and archaeological evidence, the reality becomes clearer. These sources show an extremely organized system, where even death followed a protocol. Nothing happened by chance. There was no room for sentimentality. It was like a machine. It fought, fell, was removed, dismantled, and replaced. It was that simple. But look, if this content is making sense to you so far, do the following. Give me a sign. Comment one down here so I know you're with me on this journey. And remember, YouTube only spreads this kind of knowledge if there is a lot of interaction. If you haven't commented yet, now is the time. I want to see this video full of opinions, questions, and reflections, so this topic continues to reach more people who love history like you. When we talk about the Roman Empire, it is very easy to confuse what was real with what has become myth. Part of this comes from movies, of course. Part comes from books, series, and even historical discourses shaped centuries later. But the main reason for this confusion is quite simple. We have a natural tendency to soften pain and romanticize tragedy. It is more comfortable to think that gladiators died with honor, that they were honored with rituals, or that the Romans had some kind of spiritual respect for the dead. But the truth, when you look closely, is different. Rome was grand, no doubt, but it was also cruel, practical, and often cold. Every part of society worked like a machine, and gladiators were part of that. They were trained, armed, thrown into the arena, and discarded. The respect many earned in life was based on performance, usefulness, not human dignity. This difference between the real Rome and the imagined Rome says a lot about the way we view the past. We want to see meaning. We want to see justice. We want to see emotion. But the ancient world, especially the Roman world, didn't always offer that. And that's exactly why studying real history is so important, because it forces us to face facts as they were, not as we would like them to be. Coming this far, perhaps the biggest surprise is to realize that death in Rome was not the end point. It was just another step in the functioning of a vast system. Gladiators were praised while they served, but as soon as they fell, they became just another body to be removed from the arena. This raw, direct, almost soulless gaze says a lot about how Rome saw the world. There was no room for pause, nor for mourning. It was constant movement. And, at the center of it all, the spectacle. The show could not stop. But as harsh as this reality may seem, it carries a powerful lesson. The more we understand the backstage of history, the more we understand what we have become today. Rome haunts us not only for its glories, but for the shadows that we still recognize in modern society. Now, if you've come this far, you've already realized that there's much more to it than what we learned in books. And if you want to continue this journey and discover a detail even more surprising about what really went on behind the scenes of the empire, click on the video that is appearing on the screen now. Trust me, you will look at Rome in a completely different way after this. See you there.